Hey vinyl community, Elliot here with Lazy Dogs Records, and I'm doing a video today uh, to explain what beach music is. Now, John at Digital Gramophone and I have briefly discussed back and forth on several occasions. He'll say, you need to do one, or I'll say, no, you need to do one. Somebody needs to do a video to explain what beach music is. Now, both John and I raised in North Carolina, and if you're from North Carolina or South Carolina, maybe Georgia and Virginia, you know what beach music is. But the vast majority of people, when they hear the term beach music, they have incorrect assumptions about what it means. Now, first of all, let me explain. I am not a beach music expert, although I've dug into it extensively of late, trying to prepare this. But if you're born in North Carolina or South Carolina, it's in, you know what beach music is. You know it when you hear it, and you know a lot about it, even if you're not in the culture itself so much. By the time I was a teenager, beach music, there were different camps, of people. And when we, got 16, 17, 18 years old, some of us went over to the beach music camp. More of us were in the rock camp. But if you were a few years younger than me, you were more than likely in the beach music, immersed in the beach music culture. So I'll start off with what beach music is not. Okay, so beach music is not surf music. Okay, it's not the music that we hear on the beach music or on the beach movies. Frankie Avalon and Annette Funicello and all those sorts of things. It's not Dwayne Eddy or any of those surf guitar sounds or anything like that. The noise you hear, as soon as I start a video, my dog Chester gets down there with a bone and just starts gnawing on it. I don't know why he does that, but he does, so don't be too disturbed by that sound. Okay, it's not the Beach Boys or Jan and Dean or any of that music that often makes reference to the beach. Okay, it's not trop rock, which is like the Jimmy Buffett and related acts music that has settings in the tropics and things like that, and has a tropical or Jamaican beat sometimes and things like that. It's not yacht rock. Okay, so it's none of those things, and I may have covered all the possible assumptions people had, incorrect assumptions, but I may have left some out. Okay, so now, what is beach music? Well, beach music is usually a smooth soul music sound, often acts from Motown, Stax, that sort of those sort of labels would be music that would be considered beach music. Not all the music that various acts from Motown or Stax or any of them put out. It's certain cuts, certain singles, or that they put out. It has a definite parameters that it has to fit within. Often they're obscure 45. Sometimes they're B-sides of hits, things like that. Sometimes it's from regional artists. In the modern era, it's often from bands that are regional bands. Sometimes it's music from artists that have other, might not stereotypically fit the beach music mold, but their particular songs would work in it. It's R&B music, okay, and it's specifically it's music that needs to fall in between 100 and 130 beats per minute. That's prerequisite. That's why a lot of songs that different artists do that would be soul artists, for instance, or R&B artists, wouldn't fit, and that's why some music from artists that you wouldn't call soul or R&B might fit, because about 110 beats per minute is ideal, I'd say, something along those lines. Okay, the first generation bands that we would consider beach music bands would include groups like the Tams, General Johnson and the Showmen, and then later General Johnson and the chairman of the board, Maurice Williams and the Zodiacs, the Drifters, I mentioned Showmen already, the Platters, Billy Stewart, the Dominoes, and second generation bands would be bands like the Embers and the Catalinas, the Occasions. I did a video on the second video I ever did, I believe, on the Occasions single "I'm a Girl Watcher," which would be considered a beach music classic. The Coastline Band, the Band of Oz, Swinging Medallions, Double Shot of My Baby's Love, you may remember that song, Men of Distinction, and that's just a few. I've just hit on just a few of those. So those bands are some examples of beach music bands. Okay, the origins of beach music. Oftentimes legend gets in the way of historical fact, but some of this is possibly legend, some of it is fact, but it's all based on fact. So if we go back to 1937, pre-World War II, Great Depression, of course, music was divided by race. We have documented fact here that in 1937 in Columbia, South Carolina, a bunch of white kids jumped the Jim Crow rope. Now, what do I mean by that? If you're not from the United States or maybe a little younger, you probably don't know. Jim Crow were the segregation laws in the South. And if both races were allowed in a auditorium, a concert hall, or anything like that, they would be separated. There'd be a rope dividing, where whites could sit and where blacks could sit. And we know that a bunch of white kids went to a dance hall, a black dance hall, and they jumped the Jim Crow rope. They came in. They wanted to watch the dancers, and of course they were dancing to the swing, swing, big band swing stuff, the Big Apple. And people were dancing the Lindy Hop, the Big Apple, things like that. And they got real excited, and they jumped the rope and mixed in with the African Americans in there, which would have been scandalous. If their parents had found out, I'm sure they would have been appalled, very upset with their children for doing that. But they did. So that's important. That's important. As the big bands faded after World War II, it was too expensive for them to tour with so many people and everything. The jump blues began to emerge, of course, post World War II, and R&B began to emerge. They stopped calling them race records, which were kind of all-encompassing of anything an African American performer did, and we had a category referred to as R&B, rhythm and blues. Okay, so then by about 1948, at Carolina Beach, North Carolina, there's a guy that had a nightclub, and it was called the Tijuana Inn. His name was Jim Haney. Jim Haney, and he had a friend named Chicken Hicks. Now, that's a good name right there, Chicken Hicks. And Chicken Hicks kept bugging Jim Hanna to put jump blues on his jukebox, because Chicken Hicks had something to do with bootlegging. So it was black music and white liquor. He wanted to he would go to Seabreeze either to buy white liquor from the African American, someone in the African American community, or bring in shipments of white liquor to their clubs. I don't know which, but he was, you know, he was involved in the bootlegging business, of course, because everything's dry back then. And so he kept going over to this little community, African American community near Carolina Beach called Seabreeze, and he kept hearing, wherever he went there in the Seabreeze community, this jump blues, and he loved it. And he would see the folks dancing and everything, and he loved it. And he kept bugging his friend at the Tijuana Inn to get some jump blues and some early R&B. Actually, jump blues, not quite early R&B yet. I think that will come a couple years later. But put this jump blues in the jukebox. And Haney relented eventually after repeated bugging from Chicken Hicks, and he started putting jump blues in his jukebox, and things just took off. Everybody, they wouldn't even play the other music. They kept putting their nickels in there to play the jump blues and to dance. And as it caught on, rapidly it caught on. What happened was there was a boardwalk, still is a boardwalk at Carolina Beach, and there were these crude little pavilions set up, and people saw how popular it was at his place. So they were kind of open air, just a tin roof with a dance floor, no walls on the side, and a jukebox in the middle of the place, and full of jump blues. And people were hitting these clubs, and you could be underage then. You didn't have to be an adult to go in these places. And they'd go in and they would just dance up a storm and just have a big time. And Jim Haney eventually saw how popular it was all becoming. It was a bowling alley across the street from his place. He bought that, tore out the inside, built a dance floor and a stage, and I think it was called Bop City. He started a new club called Bop City, there, and so word got around up and down the coastal towns, and more people started getting into this music. And meanwhile, in South Carolina, Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, people say, "Oh, it started here." Like most things, it spread, and it was oftentimes things that didn't exist before start happening at the same time at different places. So there was one guy that had controlled the jukeboxes up and down the Grand Strand. Now, if you've ever been to Myrtle Beach, it's not one place. It's a strand of beaches up and down the coast of South Carolina, northeastern South Carolina. And he got all his singles, his 45s from, I guess they were 45s. Now we're in that period of 45s and 78s and 45s. So I believe since it was a jukebox, I believe they would already be 45s. He got his 45s from Florence, South Carolina, not too far away from Myrtle Beach, inland from Myrtle Beach. And he stocked the records, and you had a jobber, I guess you'd call it, that would go weekly. Probably he'd get the money, or maybe more often, depending on how popular the jukebox was. He'd get the money out of the jukebox. He would put in new records and take out records that had been in there a long time, and or ones that he could see weren't being played. And so he stocked all his all his jukeboxes with the records from the supplier out of Florence, South Carolina. But there's one beach back then, Jim Crow, remember, segregated South. There was one beach there along the Grand Strand, Atlantic Beach, which was in what is now called North Myrtle Beach. Atlantic Beach was a black beach. The cottages there were owned by middle class and wealthy African Americans. They had their own beach because they couldn't go to the white beach. So they, that was a destination for African American society of people that had a little bit of money. at least. And so they didn't want, the Tex Ritters and the, who else? Hank Williams and the country and the Bing Crosby, the pop and the stuff like that. That's not what they wanted in that jukebox, those jukeboxes in Atlantic Beach. So he had to send up to South Philly, Philadelphia, to a supplier up there to get the race records, the jump blues and R&B records. So he would get shipments down from there. Hey, Chester. Chester says hi. He would get shipments down from there that would have the music that would be popular at Atlantic Beach. And he would fill that up. Now, as one song, he would rotate the songs out of the jukebox, or jukeboxes there at Atlantic Beach. He would take those records that had already cycled through those jukeboxes, and he would fill in, so he wouldn't have to have as many records, he thought. He would fill in the jukeboxes that the white patrons were putting money in other places on the grandstand. And so, you might have a jukebox with 40 singles in it, and there might be 5 or 10 of them that came from the jump blues or the R&B section, and they started finding that those were the songs that kept getting played over and over. So that's kind of the origin of how how beach music really began. Now, to further explain how this beach music phenomenon was created, got started in the segregated South, very conservative households and small towns throughout North and South Carolina and the cities. There weren't many really big cities, Raleigh, Charlotte, Columbia, Charleston. It was not considered proper or acceptable to be listening to so-called race records, R&B records, but these kids went on vacation, and they went to the beach, and the parents let them go out, whatever, Carolina Beach, Atlantic Beach, Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, wherever they might be. They were kind of on their own, even as young teenagers, they would hang out in these little pavilions and piers and places like that had jukeboxes, and they would hear this music. Now, they were also hearing this music from another source. There back when AM ruled the airways, you had clear channel radio stations. I think it was 50,000 watt stations. The lower power stations had to turn off at sundown. And when they did, these channels out of Chicago, Atlanta, New York, and different places, their signals would come in. You could pick them up over the airways, hundreds and thousands of miles away sometimes. Well, there was an R&B station in Nashville, Tennessee. I don't remember the call letters off the top of my head, but they were playing this music all night long. So the young people, when they get away from earshot of their parents, they were tuning in that Nashville station. And when they went to the beach, they were hearing this music on the jukeboxes. And the college kids would, go on spring break or go down in the summertime to the beach, work as lifeguards at Myrtle Beach or, whatever, work in the clubs there and things like that. They were hearing this music and loving it, and they were developing the dance that I'll talk more about in a minute. And so they associated this R&B / soul music we're hearing in the late 1940s through the 50s. It wouldn't be called soul then, it would be called R&B, and into the early 60s. They associated this music with the beach. Thus, they called this music beach music. So that's how it gets its name. So now I want to play for you a classic beach music song or two, and I'll interject periodically a few songs. You could make a blind man see. You could make a crippled man walk. You could make the quietest man in the world talk. Nobody else will do. Every little boy and child wants to get his arms around. For no one else will do but you. With your 3921 party shape, yes, you got me going aiming and aim over you. So there's the showman with 392146. That would be considered one of the one of the classic beach music songs. And by the 1960s, beach music is christened beach music, and some codification, some definition, some standardization begins to form as what is and what is not beach music. What do you call this music we're dancing the shag to? It's beach music, that sort of thing. Really, about 1965 is the golden year, and the 60s were the golden age for beach music. Paralleling the British invasion, you had this just overwhelming movement by young people in the Carolinas, Southeast in general, Carolinas in particular, to what had now been dubbed beach music. A genre has emerged. Sweet soul music, it might be called. White society has become a little more accepting of black culture. We're in the middle of the civil rights movement, so attitudes are beginning to change. Some never changed. Some changed more than others. Some changed more quickly than others. But the music kind of, I guess you'd say, led the way in some aspects of that. And we began to see clubs emerge, not just on the coast, not just at Myrtle Beach, Atlantic Beach, Carolina Beach, places like that, but in Columbia, South Carolina, and Raleigh, North Carolina, Charlotte, all kinds of places that were specifically beach music clubs. Now, they may not all have labeled themselves that because the name was new, of course, but these clubs began to emerge. The Embers Club in Raleigh would be an example, but there were clubs in one or two clubs in every city, and this would hold true for years and years. So a circuit emerged. Now, you've always heard about the Chitlin circuit for the African American acts playing black clubs throughout the South. Well, now an additional circuit emerges for those African American acts, and that's this circuit of playing these white clubs. Now, this is exclusively white. I don't think you would see any African American patrons in these clubs. We're talking about 1965, 68, 70, North and South Carolina. So, the artists were oftentimes black, but the patrons were. This was a white thing. Not a famous place in my local community, out in the middle of nowhere, about 25 miles from where I sit, in a county called Sampson County, which is just very, very rural eastern North Carolina, around Mingo Swamp, kind of between Dunn and Harnett County. I live in Harnett County, but not in Dunn. Between Dunn and Clinton, somewhere out there in the woods, there was this place called Williams Lake. It had been a mill. They dammed up the water and created a lake for a mill, and eventually it became a recreation center, a place people swam. It had a pavilion and it had a jukebox. And in 1965, a gentleman named Honeycutt, last name was Honeycutt, that Mr. Williams was getting old and his health wasn't that good. And Mr. Williams allowed Mr. Honeycutt, a young gentleman, to take over management of the Williams Lake Club. And it was just a pavilion, basically, a dance floor and a jukebox. And he built a dance floor. I mean, he already had a dance floor. He built a stage, and he started bringing in some of the most amazing acts you can imagine. And people that are, 10, 15 years older than me, they talk about this place, how cool it was, how much fun they had, what great acts they saw there. And it's one of those cases where, I wish I was, no, I don't, because if I did, I'd be 15 years older than I am now. I might not be here. So Williams Lake, I've looked at a list of bands that played there. Now, Williams Lake was only open for 5 more years, from 1965 to 1970. They booked acts, and then it shut down. The Tams played there. Maurice Williams and the Zodiacs. Jackie Wilson played there. Now, we're talking about the middle of nowhere, out in the woods. The Drifters, the Platters, Martha Reeves and the Vandells, Mary Wells, Rufus Thomas played there. Junior Walker and the All-Stars played there. And I'm going to play you something from this gentleman. This is Fat Boy from Billy Stewart. Billy Stewart played at Williams Lake. Here I am, baby. Here I am. You see, fat boy, that's me. I gotta make it back in town. I met a girl. She sure looks sweet. She really knocked me off of my feet. When she said I was her pride and joy, and she was in love with a fat boy. Little girl, I want you to know. So, because you said I was your pride and joy, and that you're in love with a fat boy. So all these acts were playing a circuit that would basically be the beach music circuit here. But now the thing was, and this held true for many genres of music, oftentimes artists travel not with a full band. They might travel alone, or they might travel with just, 1 or 2 accompanants, and they would pick up what they had, the band, wherever they were going to play. And so this occurred sometimes. So what happened was, on the nights they didn't have a big national act at a place like Williams Lake, they started booking bands, local, just like when the Beatles came along. So many teenagers formed bands. This was true for the beach music phenomenon too. The young high school kids started forming bands, and they would be the band if the Tams were playing on Saturday night at Williams Lake, then the a band like the Tassels was playing Friday night, and then they were backing up the Tams on, or opening for, backing up the Tams on Saturday night, things like that. So these bands started forming. So you had a second generation of bands forming, mostly, not exclusively, mostly white kids forming these bands. The Ember is probably the most famous of those bands. The Tassels I already mentioned. Swinging Medallions, you remember Double Shot of My Baby's Love was a national hit. They were one of those bands. Also, top 40 radio during this golden era, many of the songs they played on top 40 radio were beach music classics too. The Foundations, the British soul band, the Foundations, Fill Me Up Buttercup, that was a huge hit. I remember that song is in my brain since I was 7 years old, probably 5 years old. Trying to think of another that would be an example, but that's a good example. Fill Me Up Buttercup. Oftentimes it wasn't the hit single, but they'd flip over and see what's on the B side, and it would be something that was suitable for beach music for the dancers. It was very singles oriented, and so this was a vibrant period, and the music was extremely popular. One of the most popular bands you just heard was Chairman of the Board, and Give Me Just a Little More Time. That was it's a beach music classic, of course. Now you're going, oh, I know that song. I didn't call that beach music, but if you were here, you called it a beach music classic. Now, one of the big things was these, because of the beach music genre or subgenre, if you want to call it that, here in the Carolinas, a lot of acts whose best days nationally had passed. They had some hits, say in the mid '60s, and then they weren't the hip thing anymore, or maybe into the '70s. They could get on this beach music circuit and make a living, make a good living, traveling about up and down in the southeastern United States, playing these clubs. Bands like the Tams did that. The Chairman of the Board lasted forever till General Johnson passed away. They hadn't had national hits in years, but they were extremely popular. They demanded high prices to play your club, and they were very popular. And then other acts that were R&B oriented acts that we wouldn't really call beach music, but could fit into that category. They made a living. I know Delbert Mcclinton, for instance, the R&B / blues / country artist. He said he went through a dry spell in the '80s where he didn't have a record label for a while, and he just wasn't in demand. He just couldn't get much money, touring nationally anywhere. He toured that beach music circuit because many of his songs would work for the shag dancers, and they kind of fit but I mean, nobody ever calls Delbert Mcclinton. I don't call him a beach music artist, but much of his music would work in that, and they could adapt it. They could make it, slow the tempo or speed the tempo up to make it suitable for the dancers. So, he said that saved his career there for a while, and eventually he got, had a resurgence and what limited. Now, the thing for me during that 80s period, I'm a big Delbert Mcclinton fan. I didn't go to beach clubs. Beach was like frat boys, the beach clubs and stuff, with like getting dressed up in Izod shirts and khaki pants and penny loafers and, dancing, and, that wasn't our thing really. But because he was already, someone like Delbert Mcclinton was already playing, he could get jobs on the beach circuit. He'd also get jobs at, at the college clubs and things like that weren't beach oriented, and doing his blues / country / rock / R&B music. So, he was able to get plenty of work like that. That was true for a lot of artists. Resurgence for some of the blues artists as well along those lines. Now, what I want to talk to you about now is the dance, the shag. And before I do, we'll play, let's see which one I want to play next. Let's play the Band of Oz, which is one of those second generation bands that's very popular. And they're doing the song, Shaggin'.
All over the country, playing music here and there. I've been from Maine to FLA, the people discoing everywhere. But there's something I gotta tell you, girl, when I get back home. Way back to the Carolinas, the way we dance, it can't be wrong. 'Cause we're shagging in the daytime and popping all through the night. Oh, everybody's dancing and singing, the feeling, it's so right, baby. And to the beach in the summer to get some sand in my shoes. Well, everybody's laughing and singing, 'cause they just can't lose. You see, we're dancing in the streets, but there's parties everywhere. It's something for you to see. Girl, I'd like to take you there. 'Cause we're shagging in the daytime and popping all through the night. Well, everybody's dancing and singing, the feeling, it's so right.
All right. The dance. Beach music is all about dancing. This is a dance music. The dance is called the shag. Now, I know anybody that's watched that movie with the British spy from the 1960s, and shagging, baby, and all that. That's the first thing I think of. We have one of those little moments where when we say shagging, when everybody wants to revert back to their 7th grade self and giggle and laugh and make some joke. But while shagging means sex in the UK, shagging is the shag is a dance here in the United States. There's actually 3 shag dances. There's the collegiate shag and there's the St. Louis shag, neither of which are really that close to what we're talking about. And to distinguish it from those other 2 shags, it's generally called the Carolina shag today. Now, Carolina shag, I mentioned earlier those young white kids jumping the Jim Crow rope to watch the black dancers in 1937 in Columbia, South Carolina. Well, they adapted, they watched and studied the dance moves and everything. They adapted the Big Apple, and they came up with the Little Apple. And so the white version of the Big Apple is called the Little Apple. The Shag is kind of based on the Big Apple and the Little Apple and the Lindy Hop, and it's not nearly as fast as the Jitterbug, but all those things are kind of, they intermesh everything. But the emphasis in the Shag is on smooth gliding technique, and it's a blues shuffle. Specifically, as we said, it needs to be around 110 beats per minute, 100 to 130. You can shag to it. It's in 4/4 time. It needs to be something that, as some have said, you can hold your beer in one hand and shag if you want to, and not spill your beer. So it's not a real fast. It's a mid-tempo dance. There's lots of room for improvisation. It's okay. We'll get real technical here. The shag is something you've got to learn how to do. Once you get the steps and the rhythm, you can do a basic shag, but there's lots of room for variations and improvisation. But getting that, I've never learned to shag. I've never gone to a lesson or anything like that. A lot of us will fake it. I've faked it before, but I know anybody that knows how to shag would look at anything I was doing and going, that does not have a clue, because I don't. But it's a 6-count, 8-step pattern. It's not in a box, but it's a 6-count, 8-step pattern. It's 1 and 2, 3 and 4, and then 5, 6. And the 5, 6 is as long as the 1 and 2, 3 and 4 total. Okay, and so that's now one of the interesting things. I'm going to put a couple of links, and you can see Charlie Womble, and I'll probably put Charlie Womble and his wife Jackie McGee dancing, and they're like the legends in shag dancing and beach music. I'll probably put one of them. They're older than me now, or at least as old as me. They're in their 60s, and they're just amazing dancers themselves. I'll put one of them and then I'll put one or two of the younger people dancing. The thing you'll note about shagging is that it's the female is not emphasized. Their moves are not emphasized in the dance. It is a male. There's an emphasis on the male dancer. The peacock of the two is the male. He's the one that does the fancy moves and shows off. The female is more in this dance, is more in a supporting role. They don't take the elaborate moves, fancy moves for the most part. I'm sure there's some that might, but that's not the tradition or how it normally goes. So in the description up here, I've got links to several, or you can just type in Carolina shag dancing or something like that. The thing about what you'll see is I look for some of just people in clubs dancing and everything. As long as you can do that 6-count, 8-step maneuver, those steps, you can get out there and you can dance with somebody and do it properly. But I couldn't find any real video of anybody at like Fat Harold's, big club, Fat Harold's, North Myrtle Beach. Couldn't find any good video of that. So what I've put up there for you is professional level dancers. They compete. There's lots of competitions, and so they're going to do all the fancy moves, and they're going to do stuff that'll be pretty impressive to you. But your average shagger, somebody that goes on a Friday or Saturday night to one of the get-togethers or to a club and dances shag, isn't normally nearly as elaborate as these folks that are competing, on a national, international level. So things kind of waned in the 1970s, and there was a resurgence in mid to late 1970s, about the time I was getting out of high school. Uh, and resurgence, and it really hasn't ever really dipped too far since then. Your golden age was your 1960 to 1970 or so, but with the golden age over, by the mid 1970s, people were dancing again. You had disco dancing. There was also a resurgence in the oldies music, and so much of the music you shag to, or beach music, would be at this point by the mid 70s considered oldies music. Uh, Also important here is the original beach music and shag dance folks were becoming middle age, and they had more disposable income. Now, they didn't want to go out to a club where a bunch of 18 or 25-year-olds were hanging out, college crowd or anything. So they developed there was a resurgence of clubs that were specifically beach music clubs by 1980 or so. Uh, and they had disposable income. So now you start seeing uh, beach music festivals, just as bluegrass festivals had risen up in the late 60s, mid to late 60s, and in the 70s. By the 1980s, you start seeing multi-day, oftentimes, beach music festivals all over North and South Carolina, inland and on the coast. And, there might be 12, 15 bands booked for the weekend or something like that. And so and that would be a mix of the college kids. This was especially big with your frat boys and sorority girls and stuff like that. Uh, Not well, just that's who it was kind of oriented to. Country club crowd, that sort of thing. But some people may be offended by me saying that, so I apologize if you are. But that was my opinion, my take on it. I kind of shied away from that crowd. Uh, but But then you had these middle-aged people by the 1980s. They had disposable income. Maybe their kids got a little age on them. They'd kick their kids. They'd teach them to shag dance. That would be a tradition. You teach these folks that were immersed in this. They teach their children how to shag, uh, carry them out to outdoor festival or something like that, and you began to see organizations spring up. The biggest of which was SOS. You'd think it was Society of Shaggers, but it's Society of Stranders for the Grand Strand at Myrtle Beach. That organization rose up, and they started, just like the motorcyclists all converge on Myrtle Beach for a weekend. There's another weekend where the shaggers all converge at Myrtle Beach, North Myrtle Beach, go to Fat Harold's and Spanish Galleon back then, and Ducks and different places like that, different clubs, and they had bands playing all around, and they had all kinds of stuff. Dance instruction began. These dance, oftentimes at these clubs and at these organizations, people, just about every little town or a town in every county in North Carolina you'll see a little notice in the newspaper, back when we read newspapers, a little notice that said, the Harnett County Shagger Society will be meeting Saturday night, and guest DJ will be so and so, or they're going to have a band there, and dance instruction will be from 6 to 7. There'll be a meal there for everybody to enjoy at 7, and at 8 everybody starts dancing. Things like that. So you had this structure, organization, institutionalizing the music or the art, and I can't emphasize enough, passing this on to their children and their grandchildren. The Cammys emerged, a awards program and Hall of Fame, things like that, for beach music and shagging, and the DJs. The DJs are extremely important when it comes to beach music, because you don't always have a band there, but you've got a DJ. All over the Carolinas, you've got radio stations, not full. You've got a few full-time beach music radio stations like 94.9, the Surf at Myrtle Beach would be an example. But you've got uh, beach music shows, radio shows uh, on all these stations. We've always had them. Fessor John Hook, who would have a top 40 and things like that. Steve Hardee's Beach Party went on for 45 years. Steve Hardee tragically or sadly, he lived a good life, good long life, but he sadly passed away back in April of this year. For 45 years, he had Steve Hardee's Beach Party, which was syndicated to all these little stations all over. And you had DJs that played the society get-togethers, the DJs that would be hired for the street festivals and things like that, playing beach music. And uh, the uh, the clubs, as I mentioned, Fat Harold's in North Myrtle Beach, probably the most famous. And I went to Fat Harold's one time back in the late 80s, early 90s. It wasn't much happening the night I went. I just told my wife and a friend that was with us, I said, let's go to Fat Harold's and drink a beer. I've always heard about it. I have friends that are big beach music people, but I'm not a big beach music person. And we went and hung out for a little while. Wasn't much going on the night we were there. But it's still, as far as I know, still in operation today. Uh, but the DJs were very important. Now, today, beach music is still thriving. You've got the Carolina Shag dance, which has become a part of the swing dance competitions. In fact, Charlie Womble and his wife Jackie McGee won the overall U.S. Open swing dance U.S. Open doing the Shag. I mean that had never happened before. It's now a part of the U.S. Swing Open. It's taught in dance classes and things like that all over the world, as I understand it, not just here in the Carolinas. So it's being preserved in that way as well. There's lots of competitive dancing that is for the Carolina Shag. They have lots of competitions in different places, and as I say, it's incorporated into swing dance clubs and things like that. The bands that play beach music, I call them show bands. Usually they have matching jumpsuits and things like that. Horn driven usually. Not really my cup of tea, to be honest with you. It's the slicker beach music, but those bands thrive here. If you've got a street festival in your town, 9 times out of 10, the primary band they book will be a beach music band like the Band of Oz or the Embers or the Coastline Band, something like that. So they make the best money around here because they appeal to all ages, I guess. There's also a resurgence in the old R&B, the grittier R&B stuff, and there's kind of two camps, as I understand it, in the beach music community now. That grittier R&B person that doesn't want any of the new sounds, the non-R&B soul-oriented sounds incorporated into it, and the folks that it's all about the dance and exactly what you play to dance the Shag to. They're not that picky about it. But as I mentioned, the Greek organizations, there's a tradition within those of embracing beach music. The country club set, might book the Catalinas or somebody to play their their party or their dance or something like that. The beach music is resilient. It's hasn't gone anywhere. It has made it all these years and is still going. It's being preserved. It's not an antiquity. It's living and breathing. And I think that's an interesting thing about the genre of music. A few pop history or pop culture notes. I'll tell you what. Let's listen to the it'll I'll put on the Catalinas doing Summertime's Calling Me is another good example, and then I'll come back and offer a couple more. Thanks.
I remember this past winter, I told myself to settle down, and I seriously tried to do just that. But here I am with everything so beautiful and green, and I don't believe I told myself what I mean. Maybe someday soon I can feel this way year round, but it's summertime and I don't want to stay in this town. No, I want to sit there in the sand, watch those golden sands go walking by. I know it isn't fair, but you might really care, but it's different now. The summertime's calling me.
Okay, I mentioned pop culture before we went to that music there. Let's see. Pat Conroy, the late great novelist. He has a novel called Beach Music. It's he's a great writer. You might want to check that out. It's kind of involves him trying to connect with his daughter through beach music. Hey, let me teach you how to shag. This is the song your mother and I used to dance to, and things like that. So it's a nice novel from Pat Conroy from South Carolina. So you might want to read that. There's a movie, Shag, I believe it's called. Penelope Cates, is it Cates, and Bridget Fonda movie from the 1980s. It is a Hollywood version of Shag. The accents are awful. They have no grasp of how to sound like somebody from upstate South Carolina. They just don't have it. And if you can get through that and realize, like anything, it's not going to be a totally true representation. There's that movie about it. Let's see, what else? Alabama, the country band, they have a club here, Alabama Theater, and they had a song, "Dancing Shagging on the Boulevard," which was a country hit. Which it's just the topic is the shag dance here at Myrtle Beach. The awards program is at the Alabama Theater these days, I believe. Okay, so when you hear the term beach music, I hope you'll know what we're talking about now. And my apologies to beach music experts that may watch this and find some errors in my my presentation. Please correct me down below in the comments. Anything you hear, or anything that doesn't sound quite right, or anything I got right that you want to give me a thumbs up for, that would be great as well. I searched on YouTube to see if anybody had done this before, and I couldn't find anything very detailed or very specific. So I said, okay. I mean, it's probably something out there. I just didn't find it. But here's the first stab at it, and if anybody wants to follow up on this with something, that would be great as well. So I'll remind everybody: be kind to your neighbor, because guess what? We're all neighbors in this world. We need to show love to one another. Take care.
I was dreaming last night when I got the notion to pack my bags and head out for the ocean. And I was thinking today was good times last year, looking have some fun in the